Okay, some of the objectives of what we're going to be learning today is explaining how the Constitution provides for presidential succession. So what happens if the president dies? Who is the next in line? Understand the constitutional provisions relating to the president's disability. So if the president is unable to perform his job duties, who has that job and who will perform those job duties for them? And describe the role of the vice president. Okay. The presidential succession, okay, this is a scheme by which the president's vacancy is filled. So make sure if anything that is in red, you write those down in your notes because those are important. Okay. The second thing is the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. The current law fixing the order of succession to the presidency after the vice president.
Wait, I have a question.
Yes, Emily.
I can't see your screen.
Go ahead on top. You will see Troy Jensen and then Troy Jensen presentation. Click on the Troy Jensen presentation.
Oh, let's see. Why? No, I can't find this. Okay. Sure. I don't know why this isn't working.
You're totally fine.
I don't know why this isn't working. I'm sorry.
No, you're okay.
I don't know why this is so confusing. It worked for me last time really easily. I don't know.
Okay, are you able to see the PowerPoint now?
No, I can't. I don't know what's up with this. Full screen. Present now. Time screen. I don't know. Okay, wait. I don't know what's wrong with my computer right now.
You're okay, Emily.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. Just go ahead and at the top of the screen where it shows the people, where you'll see like the individual, click on that. Yeah. And then click on all the way down. It'll say Troy Jensen presentation.
Oh, this one? Oh, wait. Okay. I see what you mean now. And then you just like...
Can you see the presentation?
Let's see. Oh, wait. Okay. I think I figured it out. Never mind.
Okay, you're good. You're good. Okay, so these are the things that you need to make sure that you have written down. The Presidential Succession Act of 1947. This was a current law fixing the order of succession to the presidency after the vice president. Emily, could you mute your mic?
Oh, yeah. I need to anyways, how do you... Oh, okay. I'm not very good with technology sometimes.
No, you're okay.
Let's see. Mute. Let's see. How do you... Okay.
Awesome. All right, cool. So Emily, you can still hear me. Just raise your hand with the thumbs up if you can still hear me. Okay, cool. So the Presidential Succession Act was a current law fixing the order of succession to the presidency after the vice president. A balance the ticket is really the practice of choosing a vice president that would really fuel that role and a running mate who can strengthen the presidential candidate's chance of being elected. So our current presidency, we think of Donald Trump and Mike Pence. Mike Pence really got the religious vote or the Protestant vote for Donald Trump because Donald Trump isn't really too religious and he didn't appeal well to religious groups. But when he chose Mike Pence as his running mate, who is an ultra religious congressman, it really helped those groups of individuals who wanted to vote for a religious candidate. Okay, so they seen, well, Mike Pence is his vice president, so I'm going to vote for President Trump. Okay, so make sure you have those threes written down. Okay, so start us off. What occurs when the president is unable to perform his duties in office? Okay, this is if a president dies, resigns, or is removed by impeachment. The vice president kind of succeeds to the presidency. We've seen this with Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon. Now, Gerald Ford wasn't technically the best candidate. Like his approval ratings were quite low compared to Richard Nixon, but Gerald Ford was the vice president of Nixon. So when Nixon kind of resigned from office, Gerald Ford took those responsibilities. Now, when it came to re-election time, Gerald Ford did not run for president again. He knew that the American people, based off his rating, really didn't like him too much. So he decided to step down. Okay. Another, example of if a president is unable to perform his job duties is if the president is temporarily, incapacitated, meaning like if he's sick or if he's got a disability or something happens to where the president is unable to fulfill his job. The vice president then becomes the acting president until the president can resume. Now, the vice president's role and his job duties is really determined by the president of the United States. In the Constitution, the vice president only really has two job duties. First is to be, the president if something happens to the president. And second is if the president were to die, then the vice president would take the position and serve. Sorry, I'm being confusing. I was trying to fix something on my computer. Vice president serves as president if the president dies or is unable to perform the job duties. And second, the vice president serves as the president of the Senate. Okay, he is the tie-breaking vote. That's just based off the Constitution. Those are the only two roles in the Constitution that the president has. Okay. Okay, so presidential succession. The vice president succeeded the president 9 times in U.S. history, beginning with John Tyler and replacing William Harrison in 1841. At first, the vice president technically really only assumed those job duties of presidency, but it kind of changed over time, the role of the vice president. We see with the George Bush Jr., his vice president, Dick Cheney, actually exercised quite a bit of war powers, specifically when it came to the second Gulf War. Okay. However, the custom was that the vice president took the president as well. When John F. Kennedy died, Lyndon B. Johnson was actually sworn in on Air Force One. Okay. This is kind of a picture of the official swearing into office, but we always need a president of the United States to really lead our generals, to, be the representative of the American people. Under the 25th Amendment, this was adopted in 1967. The vice president now formally assumes the entire office of presidency. Okay, so what happens if the president dies? The Presidential Succession Act of 1947 really sets the order of who will be in line to be president of the United States. The presiding officers of Congress are followed by the heads of the cabinet in order that they are created. So if the president dies, it would be the vice president, then the Speaker of the House, okay, and then the President pro tempore of the Senate. Now, what the President pro tempore of the Senate, that is the longest serving Senate congressman. So, for example, this was for the longest time the senator from Utah. This was Orrin Hatch, because he had served in the Senate for the longest amount of time. So the president pro tempore is the longest serving senator. Okay. The next would be the Secretary of State, then the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and Secretary of Homeland Security. And the 19th position is actually Mr. Jensen. That was a joke. I was hoping to get a smile out of some of you guys. So hopefully, okay, now we're getting okay. But for the most part, the Presidential Succession Act is so deep that there will always be somebody to serve as president of the United States. Now, the question always comes up, what if a bomb goes off in Washington, D.C. and kills everybody? There's always a designated survivor, which is the 19th position. And nobody knows who that designated survivor is, okay, until pretty much everybody is done for, okay? The president will kind of make a designated survivor within his first 100 days as presidency. And usually the reason behind that is if something catastrophic were to happen, we don't want that really information shared with the public. Okay. A president's disability. Now, this question really came up with FDR because at the end of FDR's candidacy, Brandon, make sure you mute your mic, buddy. At the end of FDR's candidacy, he was in a wheelchair. He was suffering from polio. And a lot of questions was like, well, should Truman take over immediately? Okay. For many years, there was really no provisions for deciding if a president was too disabled. Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke in 1919 and was too ill to meet with his cabinet for 7 months. So really, the cabinet officers were just doing their job. They were kind of doing whatever they wanted to do. Eisenhower had 3 serious, but temporary illnesses while in office. And in 1981, Ronald Reagan was actually assassinated, there was an attempt of an assassination on Ronald Reagan. So at that time, if something were to happen, who really leads the country with a presidential disability? Okay. The 25th Amendment addressed this disability issue. The vice president becomes the acting president if the president informs Congress in writing that he or she cannot carry out the powers or duties in office. The vice president and the majority of the members of cabinet inform Congress in writing that the president is incapacitated. Okay, so the president could write to Congress and say, hey, I can't do my job. Vice president is taking over. Or the vice president and the majority of members inside the cabinet, his presidential cabinet, can inform Congress of what's going on. Okay. So the vice presidency, what are the formal duties of the vice president? We kind of talked a little bit about before of what the vice president really does. His job is really identified by the president of the United States. Constitutionally, he has 2 responsibilities. If something happens to the president, he takes over and he serves as president of the Senate. Okay. And this is, if something happens to the president, this was kind of ratified by the 25th Amendment. Otherwise, the vice president must be ready to assume duties that the president really designates. Okay. Historically, the office of vice president has had a low status, and it really hasn't really came to light until like the 80s and 90s. Often the vice president's candidate is chosen because he or she can really balance that ticket to get voters who the president might not necessarily get when running to vote for him. And this really kind of helps the president get elected, due to, ideology, geographic background, race, ethnicity, and gender. When presidents in the, people that are running in the past, they've actually appointed vice presidents to kind of to target certain voters. Okay. This kind of puts a little emphasis on the presidential qualities, kind of possessed by the vice president candidate. Now, currently, our Vice President Mike Pence, he's actually helping the President of the United States quite a bit, specifically with this whole COVID-19. He's actually over the entire process of what's happening. Okay, the president is still coming out during press conferences, but Mike Pence is still kind of over this position. And that responsibility was given to him by the President of the United States. Okay. Recent vice presidents have actually had a little bit more political experience and influence. Dick Cheney, like we mentioned before, is widely viewed as like the most influential vice president in history. And the reason behind this is Dick Cheney was the lone congressman from the lone representative from the state of Wyoming for years. Because if you remember, Wyoming is one of the smallest states, and it only has 3 congressmen from that state, 2 senators and 1 representative. And Dick Cheney was this one representative for the longest time. And he represented big oil companies and gas companies. When George Bush was being elected, when he was running for president of the United States, oil companies and gas companies did not back George Bush. Okay. So what happened was George Bush reached out to Dick Cheney and asked him, could you be my vice president of the United States? One of the biggest problem is at that time when George Bush was running, he was openly kind of voiced about his anti-gay marriage policies. He was very open about this idea that he was against gay marriage, and he actually got a lot of support from a lot of ultra conservative groups because of this. But the issue was with Dick Cheney is, even though he was Republican, Dick Cheney's daughter was openly gay. Okay, so now you have you're picking up Dick Cheney so you can get that oil support and that gas money, but you're also going to lose a conservative, those hardcore conservative backgrounds with this. Okay, so when you're picking a vice president, it's very important that you know who's going to support your campaign behind that. When he picked Dick Cheney, actually a lot of gay Americans supported George Bush, even though he was open that he was against gay marriage, but because he had picked a vice president who was, kind of for gay marriage, even though he was Republican. Okay. Joe Biden, on the right of the presentation, he, was very influential to President Obama's foreign policy. Okay. No vice president has been given as much power as the president, in part because the president cannot remove the vice president. Just real quick, wanted to make sure you guys in the comment section, you put your name and class period. There are some that haven't done that yet. My student aid is actually taking roll this way, so make sure you're doing that. Okay. So let's get back to the slide. No vice president has been given as much power as the president, in part because the president cannot remove the vice president. So obviously, if you're the president, you don't want to give so much power that the vice president becomes more powerful than you, right? You want to kind of limit his power. So taking a look at this cartoon, what does the cartoon imply about the growth of the president? I'll read the little text below because you guys probably can't see that. Dad, who runs the country if anything happens to the vice president? And the dad kind of looks at his son like, kind of questioning that idea. Let me see if I can pull it up a little bit larger. Okay, the dad himself is kind of, just kind of confused because he really doesn't understand how the president really works and who runs the country if anything happens to the vice president. The dad is just questioning, well, maybe this would have to be the president of the United States, or the vice president doesn't have as much power as we think. Okay. Okay, the vice presidential vacancy. The vice presidency has been left vacant 9 times by succession, 7 times by death, and twice by resignation. Under the 25th Amendment, the president can fill a vice president vacancy by nominating a vice president who must be confirmed by both houses of Congress. There must be a confirmation hearing saying hey, we agree with this person to be your vice president of the United States. In 1973, Gerald Ford became the first vice president appointed in this fashion. Okay. Now, just a little bit of review. Now that you have learned about what occurs when the president is unable to perform the job duties of office, I want you to answer the essential question. Does the current electoral process result in the best candidate for president? So this is just kind of maybe refraining on that essential question we had last time. So I'll give you guys 5 minutes and go ahead and just re-answer that question in your notebook. Okay, does anybody have any questions or anything?
Wait, can I go back to the first slide, or I don't know.
Yes, I will. Sabrina,
Okay.
yes, this is the first question as the first time. And Katrina, did you want us to answer the question that accompanied the political cartoon? No, it was just more of an explanation. So I'll go back to the presentation for you. Which slide do you need, Emily?
I just need the first one that talks about the presidential succession and like the Presidential Succession Act of 1947.
Yes.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Jake, if you have no questions, then yeah, you are good to sign off. Ainsley, yes, I'm going to upload all of these PowerPoints.
Has there ever been a time where the line of succession went past the vice president?
No, there hasn't.
Does the vice president get like benefits that like the president has as well? Do they like kind of share that stuff?
Yes, so Air Force Two. So he gets his own private jet. It's a lot smaller than Air Force One, but it's Air Force Two. He also gets paid. I know the pay has changed based on the presidency, but a lot of that is really determined by the president of the United States. He also is protected by Secret Service as well.
Okay, I'm done with the slide, but thank you.
Okay, and then William, the presidential vacancy again. Let me grab that one. Is the present order of succession, is that the slide you're referring to, William? The red parts from the slide, Jada, they're going to be attached to quiz questions. So those are the most important ones to have.
After this, could you go to the last slide?
Yeah, for sure. The review question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, Brielle, give me a couple minutes. That way, if anybody needs that review question again, and then I'll go back to slide number 5. I will tell you guys, it has been so difficult to not be coaching right now. I actually hate it more than anything. I feel really bad for those kids that can't participate in their spring sports because it obviously sucks for sure. And I have no idea just from the coaches' end when we're going to be able to do that, if we're going to be doing it over the summer. Nothing's really been kind of told to us.
After slide number 5, could we go to 10?
Yes.